I will not be speaking about potatoes, although I have to make Catherine one correction as a proud Dutchman. We don't only eat boiled potatoes. In fact, we have the best fries in the world. We call them patat. And those Dutch here will recognize we have variations, the most famous one being een patatje oorlog. I think we Dutch... So just to set the record straight, that we don't only eat boiled potatoes. But apart from that, thank you, Catherine, for this absolutely beautiful address that you gave, so inspiring, and really thank you for those words. I would like to take the opportunity tonight, as we come towards the end of this beautiful, lively, joyful ceremony, to take the opportunity, this being my last commencement address as President and Rector of the ITI, before I step down on August the 1st and pass on the baton to my dear friend, Professor Dr. Bernhard Dollner, our Rector as of August the 1st, I would like to take this opportunity to present to you a farewell call to action. How to reclaim dignity and freedom today. That's the title of my farewell call to action. Because in fact there are underminings and attacks on freedom and dignity going on in soft ways and in hard ways in our world, the former leading to the latter. And it's happening as much internally from within our societies as externally from outside. And I would like to start with a story. In the past couple of years, and especially the last half year, me and my children have been spending a lot of time discussing Lord of the Rings. It's a book I unfortunately discovered very late. In fact, I discovered it through my children, through my sons, who read Lord of the Rings, and before that, of course, The Hobbit. And we've been having many discussions about it at home. And as I was reading the third of the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo finally has the job to bring the ring back to where it belongs so that it can burn and bring an end to that evil, there is a very moving scene somewhere to the end of the book where Frodo, with the other hobbits and accompanied by Gandalf, is returning to the Shire after conquering evil and getting rid of the ring. And one day, Gandalf finds him, Frodo, alone, sad and despondent, walking alone, apart from the rest. And Gandalf goes to him and says, "Why, Frodo, why? Why are you so sad and on yourself and despondent? There's so much to celebrate. We're going back to the Shire. We have fought the good fight." And then Frodo says, "1 year ago exactly today, the Black Rider, one of the Black Riders, stung me with his sword of poison. And today, exactly 1 year later, I feel that darkness again that came over me when he stung me." Now, without in any way wanting to be melodramatic, I would like to use this as an image that has really made me think. Because this darkness about which Frodo speaks, I sense whenever I reflect on what happened to our world since 2020. How we collectively discarded, without much of a thought or debate, the rule of law and fundamental rights for the sake of staying safe. And how we walked into almost blindly, a new war on the European continent. A war with no end in sight. In fact, if you have been following the news today, there are very worrying developments in Russia where there now seems to be actually a rebellion between Russians and a rebellious group actually marching up and taking cities over. This is a very dangerous and worrisome situation for Europe we are in. So those two things I want to take out, where I have this sense of darkness. Because as a result of lockdowns and other mandated measures invented by Chinese communists and the laptop classes, were the millions of African children who could not go to school for almost 2 years being kept safe from hunger and exploitation? Or what about the millions of youth around the world now suffering? Just today I was reading a major study that came out in England. Suffering, millions of youth around the world from depression, eating disorders, and vastly increased risk of suicide. The list goes on, but that is not for today. Neither is it today's topic to address in detail the horrors of war in Ukraine and the scandal of the suffering it is inflicting on the Ukrainian people, and also the bravery of this people in defending their country. That is not the topic of today, but I need to mention this. I need to mention it to make an important point. As what happened to our societies since 2020, COVIDism and then war and other isms, are symptoms of a much larger and longer ailment. And that is our slow, then faster, and often cynical discarding or at least undermining of the core principles and institutions of human dignity, solidarity, and freedom, on which, with all its many imperfections, the Western post-world order was built. And we are all responsible in some way, large or small, that it had actually to come to this point. And we have to ask ourselves, why? For one thing, our society has become too polarized, and dangerously so, by all sides of the spectrum, calling each other names, excluding people who think differently, the self-righteous in each one of us. But we are all humans, and all broken as well. Do we realize this and act accordingly? In the Gulag Archipelago, the Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes his many years in brutal concentration camps, interestingly also as a gift because of what he observed and learned. And I quote, Solzhenitsyn says, "And it was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties. That neither. But right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. End of the quote from Solzhenitsyn. And briefly to this last point, I have made that experience myself. I recently shared that at a conference where I spoke with young people, where I had that experience when I was in my first year of college at Franciscan University. It was mandatory to spend half a day a week in your freshman year doing social work. And I, for 1 year, worked in a maximum security prison as a social worker, working with convicted murderers. I can say that what Solzhenitsyn wrote, I experienced. I found that little bridgehead of good in all these convicted killers. And it changed my life and my perspective on life. But let's go back to the topic at hand. Let me explain why I am so passionate and insistent on this topic of the rule of law and of fundamental rights and dignity and justice. Why is it so important for me? It is not only because I am a lawyer with an academic interest in matters of philosophy of law. I am also a student of European history and keenly aware of how freedom and dignity never got lost overnight, but always in a step-by-step process of small compromises, incrementally, often cynically, that in themselves looked harmless and even justified, but taken together proved to be fatal. In her little masterpiece, They Would Never Hurt a Fly, on the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal proceedings in The Hague post-1995, Slavenka Drakulic tries to answer the question how the mass ethnic killings in her country could take place in a once civilized nation where people of different backgrounds coexisted peacefully in the 20th century post-World War II. And she observes, and I quote, "But turning your head away or remaining silent in the face of injustice and crime means collaborating with a politics whose program is death and destruction. And whether it is willing or unwilling collaboration doesn't really matter, because the result is the same." This is where Pope Francis always refers to the indifference that is such an ailment in modern society. The indifference in the face of suffering on different levels, small or large. But I guess, going back to this question, why is this such an important topic for me? My family history also plays a role. Both my grandfathers were military officers in the Netherlands at the outbreak of World War II. My paternal grandfather, in fact, was arrested in the first week of the German occupation by the Gestapo, the secret police. Until the day of today, he took it into his grave. We did not know what happened in that time because he never spoke about it when he came back. But it certainly left a deep impact on him. My other grandfather, on my mother's side, was actually called to the front at the beginning of the war. And then after the Netherlands had to surrender, he also had to stand down. And then my grandfather, on my mother's side, got actively involved in the Dutch resistance, for which he was later decorated the Dutch Resistance Cross. And my father, as a 10, 11-year-old boy in the hunger winter of 1944, 1945, where half of the Netherlands was not yet liberated, and the people in the north were not getting enough food, and many were dying of hunger. My father, as a little boy, was sent out into the countryside from the city of Utrecht on his bike without tires to go beg at farms for food. But he had to hide in the ditch very often because either German tanks or personnel carriers came by that might run over him, or Allied bombers would fly over sorties to bomb these military vehicles. It is something that impacted my family until today and is very present in my family. So it seems that the fight for justice and freedom runs through my veins. So therefore, I have for you today 3 areas where dignity, liberty, and justice are most under threat. Also in the West, where often the rest of the world lacks these altogether. The first one is freedom of conscience and religion. I'm not only thinking here of the many problems we have in the West, where, for example, doctors are increasingly not allowed to conscientiously object against certain medical procedures that they do not want to get involved in. But then I also want to speak about Nigeria. You have heard me over the years often speak about the persecuted Christians. Very few of you will probably be aware that today in the country of Nigeria and Africa, there is a massive persecution of Christians going on. For example, did you know that in the past 15 years, more than 50,000 Christians have been killed for their faith in Nigeria? Or 34,000 moderate Muslims have also been killed? Or 18,000 churches and 2,200 schools have been burned down. In fact, at this moment, 360 million people in the world are being persecuted for their faith. Are you still sitting comfortably on your chair? And this goes on. The second point I want to mention to you, where dignity, liberty, and justice are under threat. Freedom of expression, scientific debate, and independent academia and media, very foundational institutions of Western society. Don't get me started on COVID censorship and the staggering role that big tech, big business, very often in cooperation with governments played in censoring serious, peer-reviewed scientific opinions and insights. But currently, there's also other sorts of censorship going on. For example, in the whole drama of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, how the Russian government is censoring its people not getting the information they need to find out what is truly going on. So freedom of expression and freedom of scientific debate and independent academia and media is also under threat internally and externally. And the third one, freedom of education, something very close to my heart. Ever more, especially in the West, we have rules and restrictions and bureaucracy of how educational institutions should look like, instead of focusing on the beautiful words of Thomas More, who said, "Education is to make visible what lies hidden as a seed that doesn't need too many rules and regulations. But we're also thinking of the millions of young people around the world that don't have any education at all, no access to it at all. Or we have the serious problem of the sexualization of our educational systems with certain ideologies. There is a text attributed to the well-known French author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote the classic The Little Prince, that most of you will have read. And in it, he describes how the world is upside down, all norms are relative, and human society is sick. And this is what Antoine de Saint-Exupéry says. When people become godless, governments are helpless, lies limitless, debts innumerable, meetings fruitless. Then enlightening people is futile. Politicians are characterless, Christians prayerless, churches without strength, peoples restless, morals licentious, fashion shameless, crime limitless, conferences endless, prospects bleak. So what now? As you go out here today, and Catherine thankfully mentioned at various times the need to go out to take responsibility. As you go out here today into the world, a world that sorely needs each one of you, not only the graduates, I propose you focus on 3 priorities that no Catholic, no Christian should ever ignore. In fact, we all have a moral obligation to act in this area if dignity, peace, and freedom are important for us. The first one, build, strengthen, or support stable families based on sacramental marriage and open to life abundant. In the plan of the Creator, there is only one sort of marriage, that between a man and a woman for a life commitment and open to life. We need more families based on this plan of creation. John Paul II, the saintly Pope, our founder, this was his rallying cry. This was the inspiration with which he started the ITI. And society depends on it. Last Tuesday, when we had the farewell ceremony here, I shared with you how the love, the visible love of my parents until the day of today, and of my wife's parents until the day of today, is the rock on which our lives stand. And that is the rock on which we need to rebuild our societies. And let me tell you, from my many years of experience in education, also in founding a school 10 years ago, I have in front of my eyes seen happy lives being destroyed when we as grown-ups were not able to settle our differences and when marriages fell apart. But in families, it is also where vocations, both to the religious life and to married life, are bred. So first, all of us, all of you, graduates, build, strengthen, and support stable families. The second priority, found, repurpose, or get involved in schools and universities that are truly Catholic or otherwise Christian. My friends, this was how the West was built. And if you have children, let me tell you something from experience. If you have children, you have a choice to make. You have a choice to make. And that is it important for me that my children grow up into this world deeply rooted in their Christian faith and the principles and moral considerations that come with that? Then please be freed from the illusion that you can blindly send your children to any school and hope that it just will go well. That is not going to happen. You need to make a deliberate choice what you want for your children and not be deliberately blind to the challenges and the realities that are in front of us today. And finally, when it comes to that, there is nothing more important than the education of the youth, which is why I've devoted so many years of my career to it. There is nothing more important to that. And anybody who has children, there should be nothing more important than the education of your children. And please don't hide behind business or stress. It is about the soul of your children. Everybody should get involved in education. Whether you're parents or not parents, there is so much to do there. And thirdly, the third priority. Please vote and get elected or appointed to political office, or actively support those that are. How else can we change politics? I want to tell you here a brief anecdote. 3 years ago, when my oldest son turned 18, I asked some people he and I had gotten to know over the years through my work, because I always take my children along with me as much as I can on work trips. I asked those people to prepare a message for him. And one of them was my good friend Martin Lee, who is considered the father of democracy in Hong Kong. And he sent me a beautiful audio message for my son. And in this message, he pleaded with my son, saying, please, Frederick, vote. Make use of your right to vote. Because I come from a country and a region where billions of people, hundreds of millions of people, will never have that opportunity to vote. And he said, please, I beg you, make use of that. Better politics starts with you. To put it a little bit bluntly, we have to stop whining and start getting involved ourselves. Great saints went before us. My favorite, St. Thomas More, but also a recent one, King Baudouin of Belgium, where now the beatification process is starting, and many others if you start looking. In fact, I think Charles should be writing a book about it. And yes, as Pope Francis says, it makes your hands muddy, but that is part of life. And I want to quote to you here from what Pope Francis has to say about government. He says, to govern is to serve each of us, each of our brethren who make up humanity, without forgetting anyone. A person who governs must learn to look up, to talk to God, but not to act like God. And he must look down to lift up those who have fallen. He continues and says, man's gaze must always be turned in those two directions. Look up to God and down to those who have fallen, if you want to become great. The answers to the most difficult questions are always found by looking in those two directions at the same time. End of quote. When each one of us is not willing to give up comforts, recognition, or something that never fails to impact me, like the soldiers on D-Day storming the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe from Nazism, who gave their lives freely for our liberty. If we are not willing to give up our comfort zones for life itself, for the sake of dignity and freedom, who else will do it? And here I have to give you a brief personal little story that we also continue smiling. On the 5th of May 1940, when German troops had invaded the Netherlands, my maternal grandfather was called to the front. And he was all in his uniform, and he said to my grandmother, "Please pray for me that I don't have to kill anybody." To which my grandmother, who was a strong woman, said, "Well, I hope not the whole Dutch army thinks like that." But the beautiful thing about this story is, this grandfather of mine went on during the war to be active in the resistance and put his life on the line, and also at different points have to go in hiding because he was being sought after. He got the courage to actually stand up, but first overcame his fear. And I was struck, and I'm coming to a conclusion, I was struck this week by the following text from the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. He says, "Brothers and sisters, consider this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." And later he goes on, "The one who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness." So, my dear graduates, and all listening today, be generous with your talents. Because how can we change the world and reclaim the dignity and freedom of every human if you and I do not stand up and do our duty, speaking and acting in those places where we are called to be today? And there is no need to be afraid, because as St. Paul tells us, God loves a cheerful giver, and he is able to make every grace abundant for you, so that in all things, always having all you need, you may have an abundance for every good work. So, what are we waiting for? Congratulations, class of 23.